Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are in Luke chapter 20, and today Jesus is getting questioned on all sides as he is gearing up for his death, burial, and resurrection. So today we're going to be looking at many times that he's being questioned, whether it's about taxes, his authority, his humanity, or even the resurrection from people who don't even believe in it in the first place. And Jesus gives out many warnings to those who are around him and even gives a parable to try to understand it better.
So today we are checking out Luke chapter 20. You could easily call this chapter the everyone is out to get Jesus chapter because he's confronted by like different groups, one group at a time. It's almost like there's a steady line of everybody trying to get him, and none of the questions are sincere. I think that's important to understand up front. Nobody actually cares about the answers to the questions they're asking. They just want to get Jesus crucified faster.
So I guess the first part that's interesting is his authority is questioned. And who is actually the ones that are in charge of this specific questioning? I feel like it's the Pharisee, the chief priests and the scribes, okay, and some elders. They say, tell us by what authority do you have to do these things? Who gave you the authority to do basically what you do? And so again, I think it's this whole idea of like, they think this guy is super evil. They don't think he's from God. They don't think he is God or anything close to it. And really just wants to make him look like a fool.
This is interesting. You can see in his response that Jesus knows that these people are slaves to public opinion. Like they're not allowed to actually stand on anything. All they care about is keeping the power that they have. And the only way that they have the power they have is the opinions of the people. So he confronts them by responding about the power of John's baptism. And they're presented with like a really tough situation then, because a lot of people believe that John's baptism was like a godly, heavenly thing. And they can't say, like, really they can't answer either way. They can't say that it's just a man because then the crowds will be angry that it's not from God. And they can't say it's from God because then that will mean that they don't have the power that they would like to have. And so they just decide, like, basically it's a draw. They're like, okay, never mind. We actually weren't that interested anyway.
Yeah.
And then we're off to the next thing.
Jesus closes the argument a little bit there too and says, well, I'm not going to tell you by which authority I do these things. Knowing full well, I think, that they actually realize where the authority is coming from, but are refusing to
100%.
understand it, which is interesting as it leads into the parable, which is talking completely about how all these prophets, I think John included, are coming and coming and coming and being destroyed by the people that they are coming to.
It's a good thing you point that out. John the Baptist is the last Old Testament style prophet. That's it. That's done. And Jesus comes, and now we relate to God in a different way. But he tells this story. This is the thing that sticks out to me most from this whole chapter. He tells this story of the man that owns a vineyard that has to go away to a far off land to conduct some kind of business and come back to his vineyard. It feels very, very similar to the story of the 10 minas that we read yesterday, where there's a man that owns something, leaves stewards in charge of that something, and is like extremely disappointed when he returns to find that the people have been irresponsible with the responsibility that they've been given. The message is not exactly the same, but the vineyard story is very similar to the mina story, and both of them end with like pretty extreme judgment.
Well, mostly because in this one, after the people that the owner of the vineyard keeps sending out, after they keep dying and dying and dying, he's like, well, I guess like if I send my son, like I'll send my son to deliver this message. And when he does, the son is murdered just like all the rest. So it's very interesting. All these prophets that have come before, they've been ridiculed for the things that they've said. People don't believe them. People try to kill them. Same thing happens to the prophets. I mean, that's what happened to John. John was beheaded. And then Jesus comes, and what do you know? The one who is perfect, who is God in human form, they do the same thing too.
And it's funny, like this parable serves its purpose. The people understand the point immediately, and it makes them very angry. He's basically telling them like, hey, God sent you a prophet, you killed him. God sent you a prophet, you killed him. God sent you a prophet, you killed him. Now I'm here, God's own son, and you are rejecting me. If you look at verse 19, it says, the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them. So it's kind of this parable that pushes them over the edge. Like, this guy is calling us out in front of everybody. He's embarrassing us in front of everybody. We need to get rid of him. It actually says that they hire spies to question him, which is how we get the following questions. You asked a pretty interesting question before we turned on the recording, but basically, like, why didn't God just send Jesus to begin with?
Well, yeah, and I think to me it's just like God is able to do whatever he wants. But I think for our own understanding and our own like faith affirmation, it's good that the prophets were sent first, because had they not been, it would be a lot harder, I think, for me or anyone to accept that Jesus was who he said he was, had he just come and been like, yep, it's me.
Yep.
And no one came before. Like you were saying, nobody sets the roadmap for the things to come. And if he just showed up on the scene and no one had any idea that he was coming or things that were foretold beforehand, it just would feel a lot more like surfacey and something that like you're not hopeful for it.
It is really interesting. Like, make no mistake that salvation has always been through believing in the Lord's provision. People in the Old Testament believed that God ultimately would provide the ultimate forgiveness of their sins. That was Jesus. We believe that God has already provided the forgiveness for our sins. That is Jesus. So everybody throughout history has always been saved by Jesus. The prophets were trying to redirect Israel's hearts back to God, to be obedient to God, to trust that the Savior would come. Jesus is telling us he is the one who has been proclaimed. If we didn't have all those prophetic messages, there's so many prophets in the Old Testament that say things about this coming Messiah that Jesus ultimately fulfills. Like, the prophets actually lay out this incredible roadmap for us to be able to look at it and be like, well, Jesus did that, Jesus did that, Jesus did that, Jesus did that. How could he not be the Messiah? A lot of us might be familiar with some of the more famous passages like Isaiah 53, but there is literally prophetic passage after prophetic passage about this coming Savior, and Jesus is fulfilling all of them, like literally just checking them off. And so many of them he could not have done like on purpose, I guess. He could not have planned it out and fulfilled all those things. Many of them are fulfilled by other people reacting to him in certain ways. And actually, he's going to talk about some of that in this very passage.
So as we move on from the parable, obviously people are pretty upset. So it's interesting to me that the things that they are questioning Jesus about are the things that I think would really kind of rub people the wrong way. So they go to all of the things that really get people's attention. You know what that's like today. You bring up those hot topics and everybody's listening. So the first one is about paying taxes to Caesar. The scribes and the chief priests, they're asking like, well, hey, what are we supposed to do about taxes? And Jesus is put into this like goofy corner that he clearly doesn't remain in. And he just responds like, well, whoever's picture's on it, give it back to him and give God what is his. So it's just interesting. And I don't want to we can come back to it, but I think it's interesting too, that the Sadducees then, the ones who I had mentioned at the beginning, who don't even believe in the resurrection at all, start talking about, essentially widows that are just getting passed from brother to brother, which would have been part of the Mosaic law. That if the woman of a husband die, or if the husband dies, then she goes on to the next brother, the next one. And then they're like, well, when the resurrection happens, whose wife is she? And I'm sure that people would have been very familiar with this law and would have been probably questioning these types of things too, but not really putting a whole lot of feet to it. So I think everybody's ears are probably perking up. They're very interested to see what Jesus is going to say, because they think they've caught him. Like, he's stuck. He can't get out.
So back to the you're totally right. Like, these are just hot topics. Back to the taxes issue. Nobody likes paying taxes, period. Recently, we just went through tax season. You probably hated the fact that you had to pay taxes. Nobody likes it. It was especially negative in this time because the Jews, they were under occupation essentially. And so the vast majority of these people were being unjustly taxed, and they didn't even believe that they were being ruled by the correct people. So one of the interesting things that happens is that many of the Jewish people refused to even carry the money that had Caesar's face on it because they were prohibited from making an image. It's one of the 10 Commandments. You can't make an image. And so they felt like that was idol worship. You were also in the time of Rome required to essentially proclaim allegiance to only Caesar, and they saw this as a kind of worship. You were not allowed to worship Caesar, and so there was a case being made that even paying taxes was a form of worshiping Caesar. So Jesus is in this tight spot where he's either going to reject God's law and he's going to allow them to worship Caesar to some degree, or he's going to reject Caesar's law and fall on the wrong side of the Roman government. So he does this incredible thing that is like, hey, that's Caesar's face. Give that to Caesar. That's his. They half the time refused to carry it anyway. There actually was a different kind of Jewish money that was just kind of like these small coins without inscriptions and faces on them that they used. So they already hated doing it. So he's like, hey, that belongs to Caesar. Give it to Caesar, which I'm sure these greedy, rich, religious people really did not like. And then on top of it, he says, but don't forget to give God whatever is God's, essentially putting Caesar underneath God's authority and handling this incredibly wisely and giving us an example to live by today. We still are commanded to pay taxes. And guess what? Many of our taxes are used unjustly for terrible reasons. Many of us probably believe for things that we would not support ourselves. And we still are asked to pay taxes. We are asked to do it. But even more than that, we're asked to give allegiance to God where allegiance to God is due because all things are God's in the first place.
So then, again, back to the questioning that he's going through. The questions about the resurrection is an interesting one because, like I said, I'm sure there's people in the crowd that have been either affected by it, going through it, whatever.
Exactly.
Where they have to go through these different scenarios in their heads too, like, oh gosh,
so
what's it going to be like?
This is funny because it's clearly not a real scenario. They do not know a woman's name. They don't know an actual person that this happened to. This is just one of those hypotheticals that helps to prove something that's not true. So it's almost like a parable to prove something wrong. And the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection anyway. They did not believe that anybody rose from the dead. And they used this little parable, this little story of theirs to prove that there was no resurrection because this would not make sense. And Jesus, incredibly powerfully responds with, well, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is not the God of the dead. God is the God of the living. He's saying that God does not proclaim himself as, well, I used to be the God of Abraham, and then I was the God of Isaac. He says, hey, God's the God of the living. We all are eternal. None of us are passing away. And so we need to be concerned about worshiping God for eternity. Essentially, stop bugging me with silly little stories that don't make sense.
Well, and what's funny, before we even end with Jesus basically warning them about all of these different people that are going to come and be questioning and whatever, and really, I would say, pointing out their own hearts.
Yeah.
Jesus, he doesn't even wait for them to ask the question. He's just like, oh yeah, and another thing that you're probably going to try to think up in your own little brains is what I was referring to at the beginning of the episode about his lineage, where he comes from and being the son of David. And he's like, by the way, just saying, David refers to me as the Lord. So David calls him Lord. So how could he possibly be a son? He's clearing the air already. I'll get this one before you even get there.
He says that he is the son of David. That's a claim to being the Messiah. And he says that he is also God, essentially. So this is a major
it's both.
Proclamation. It's going to very much frustrate people. This on top of the fact that he just rode a donkey into the city, like Zechariah 9:9 said that he would. So there's a lot going on in this chapter. You can see why people are getting more and more angry about Jesus. As far as your part, I thought of this while we were reading over this, while we've been talking through it. For my job, I'm a curriculum writer, and I'm writing some new curriculum, and part of it is teaching people how to understand the Bible. And one of the things I wrote about is oftentimes we know what the Bible tells us. We know what it's saying, we know what it's asking us to do, and we are very good at inventing reasons for ourselves not to have to be obedient to what the text says. We're really good at reading over something that's very clear and being like, well, I don't know, what does that mean in the Greek? It's like, no, you don't actually care about the Greek.
What does that mean in our day?
You don't actually care about that. You just don't want to be obedient to that. And what sticks out to me reading over these things, these people were dealing with the exact same things. Like, these guys knew when they came to Jesus asking about this woman marrying 7 brothers that they don't actually care about that. They know what God is teaching. They know that Jesus is proclaiming he is the Son of God. They just don't want to believe it. And so I would caution you, I guess that your part is be very careful as we're reading through the Gospels, as we're reading through the entire Bible, be very careful that you're not allowing yourself to be hesitant about what the Bible says simply because you don't want to listen to it and simply because you don't want to do what it says or believe what it says. So be cautious about your own biases and be very willing to be obedient to what the Word says.
So that's what we have for this very contentious chapter of Luke 20. And tomorrow we will be back again for Luke 21 as we are nearing the end of this book. So thanks for joining us today. We'll see you back again tomorrow.
Thanks for joining today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. As always, please consider partnering with us as we are a listener-supported podcast that we hope to continue to grow with support from listeners just like you.
We've made it super easy to partner with us, and you can support us by following the link in our show notes or our description. You can support us with as little as $3 a month.
Every little bit of this helps so much, and we're so thankful for your support. With that in mind, here's today's reading.
Luke chapter 20. One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders came up and said to him, "Tell us by what authority you do these things, or who it is that gives you this authority." He answered them, "I also will ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?" And they discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." And he began to tell people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants, and went into another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants, so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully, and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent yet a third. This one also they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, so that the inheritance may be ours." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy these tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Surely not." But he looked directly at them and said, "What then is this that was written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach us the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer they became silent. There came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children. And the second and the third took her, and likewise all 7 left no children and died. Afterward the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will this woman be? For the 7 had her as a wife." And Jesus said to them, "The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, But those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die any more, because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed, in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. Then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dared to ask him any question. But he said to them, How can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David thus calls him Lord, so how is he his son? And in the hearing of all the people he said to his disciples, Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplace and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email, and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.